There's a lot of misunderstanding and fear surrounding skin cancer. In this video with the incredible Ben Fuchs, you'll discover the 3 types of cancer and the cause of long-term chronic disease.
According to Ben, when we understand what is really going on with the cell, we won't need the medical model.
There's 3 types of cancer: basal cell carcinoma, which accounts for the vast majority of cancers, squamous, and it's the most, it's the easiest cancer to deal with, we'll put it that way. The second type of cancer is called squamous cell carcinoma, and I'm going to explain these in a little bit. Squamous cell carcinoma, this is a little bit more deadly, and it has a tendency to metastasize much more than basal cell carcinoma, and this is of great concern, squamous cell carcinoma. And then there's the worst cancer of all, which of course you guys probably know, and that's melanoma. One very important fact about skin cancers is rates are increasing, not decreasing, all over the world. And this is despite the fact that we're all wearing sunscreens, and despite the fact that we're all terrified of the sun. In fact, people are terrified of the dome light in their cars. People are terrified of anything that has light in it. Despite all of the awareness and all of the so-called precautions that we take and all of the sunscreens that we use, cancer rates are still rising. So clearly there's a misunderstanding of what's going on with in how we deal with skin cancer. In order to understand skin cancer, there's 3 major points that we have to work with. Number one, the skin. We have to understand the skin, and the skin is a very misleading organ. I'm speaking to you now as somebody who's made a lot of money selling skincare products, selling topical products. There is a lot of misunderstandings about the skin. And I see a lot of women in this room. You guys are being taken advantage of like you have no idea with so-called skincare products. Another story. Go on YouTube, check out my skin videos. I don't have time to talk about that now, but I just want to say that if we don't understand the skin, we're not going to be able to understand how to deal with skin cancer. Second point that we have to address if we're going to understand skin cancer is cancer. What exactly is cancer? How come, like with skin cancer, how come we have all of this awareness and all of these oncologists and all of these strategies, yet cancer rates are still going through the roof? It's still the 2nd leading cause of death. And we really haven't done much to address these statistics over the last 50 or 60 years, despite all the research, despite all the wars that we fight on cancer, despite all the billions and trillions of dollars that we're spending on it. So we have to understand cancer. We've got to understand skin, we got to understand cancer, and then thirdly, we've got to understand the nature of the cell. And this is really the key to understanding, number 1, how to be healthy, and number 2, why we're not healthy. Why the medical model cannot help us. You see, a cell is like a little being. It's a little conscious entity. A cell, if you take a cell out of your gum or out of your mouth and you put it in a little petri dish, and then you go into another room and you think a lousy thought, that cell will change. A guy named Cleve Baxter, actually, he was a lie detector specialist, and he actually, anybody hear of Cleve Baxter? Cleve Baxter actually tested cells by putting lie detector electrodes on the cell and then having people do all kinds of things, think about the cell or think of bad thoughts or good thoughts, and literally the cell would change. And that's a cell in a petri dish. You can imagine what the impact of thoughts and feelings and environmental stresses would have on the cell in our body. Cells are little conscious beings, and they respond. This is the key to understanding the nature of a cell. It's intelligent. It is responsive, for better or worse. For better, if you do good things, you're going to have a good, healthy cell. If you do lousy things, you're going to have a lousy cell. Now, if you go to the World Health Organization's website, you'll see 12,800 different disease classifications. But if you understand the cellular nature of disease, immediately those 12,800 disease categories become irrelevant, because at the level of a cell, there aren't 12,800 different things that can go wrong. There's only 3 things that can go wrong. And when you understand this triad of breakdown that occurs at the level of the cell, and you leverage the power that that understanding affords you, all disease will be gone, and we won't have any need for doctors or specialists. Because at the level of the cell, check this out now, this is very important. At the level of the cell, the medical model is impotent. It can do nothing at the level of the cell, because the cell is not stupid. The cell will not take the medicine. In order for the medicine to get into the cell, the cell's defenses have to be overwhelmed. Now, there are strategies that drug companies use, including dosages and manipulating the molecule in order to trick the cell. There are strategies that drug companies will use to get the cell to accept the medicine, but the cell will not accept the medicine on its own, which is why the medical model is reduced to killing a cell, radiating a cell, or poisoning a cell, or electrocuting a cell. That's all the medical model can do. But that doesn't really matter, because when we understand what really is going wrong with the cell, we won't need the medical model. There are only 3 things that can go wrong with the cell. And I'm going to talk here generically about disease, but this also has to do with cancer, which is obviously a type of disease. The 3 things that go wrong with the cell: number 1, starvation. A cell can be starved, at which point it will no longer be able to process energy correctly. Number 2, suffocation. A cell can be robbed of oxygen, again, leading to a difficult time for the cell to work with energy, to produce energy. And number 3, a cell can become toxic. And sugar counts as a toxin after you have a certain level of sugar. So you've got starvation, suffocation, and toxification. These are the only 3 things that can go wrong with a cell. It can be starved, robbed of nutrients, it could be suffocated, robbed of oxygen, and it can become toxic. And sugar counts as a toxin. And ironically, prescription drugs and all drugs count as toxins. So the very treatments that we prescribe and that we deify almost, that we honor in the medical model, are cytotoxic. They kill the cell, which is maybe going to hide your symptom or change your test score, but it isn't going to do anything good for the cell, which is the core of life, or the beginning of life. So starvation, suffocation, and toxification, the only 3 things that can happen to a cell, but it gets worse. Because you see, when a cell is starved, when a cell is toxic, when a cell is suffocated and it can no longer do its business, it has a little program inside it that is a suicide program. Have you guys heard of cell suicide? It's a phenomenon known by biochemists as apoptosis, if you've ever heard of that term. And when a cell is starved, suffocated, toxic, or any combination of those things, eventually it's going to kill itself. It's going to commit suicide. It's going to die. And when a cell dies, eventually its contents start to secrete, or they get exploded all over the tissues, all over the areas, and the body will protect itself from those cellular toxins. It protects itself by building a wall around those cellular toxins. Does anybody know what that wall is called? It's called inflammation. Now, we all know about inflammation when we get a black eye, or we get a broken leg, or we sprain our ankle. That's called macroinflammation. But there is a microscopic cellular version of that inflammatory process, and because it's microscopic, we don't even think about it. We don't even know it's occurring. And so what happens is, this is a protective response, just like when you get a black eye or a broken ankle, that swellingness, that puffiness is a protective response. Likewise, it's a protective response in the cell. So the body will wall off that damaged cell area where all the acids and the enzymes have been spewed out as a protective response, and that's a good thing. But if you have chronic starvation, chronic suffocation, chronic toxification, you'll get lots of cells that are exploding and lots of these inflammatory patches. Micro-inflammatory patches. Now, the micro-inflammatory patches are functional if it happens in the short term, if it happens once in a while, if it happens in a localized area, but when it happens chronically, eventually you have these walls of inflammation that were functional in the short term, but in the long term, they keep food from getting through. They keep oxygen from getting through. They keep toxicity from leaving. So now you have more cells that are going to starve, and more cells that are going to suffocate, and more cells that are going to become toxic. So the body says, okay, we'll protect those areas. We'll protect the rest of the body from those areas with an inflammatory wall. And this keeps happening. And of course, the more inflammatory walls you have, the more cells can't get food, they can't get oxygen, and they can't clean themselves out. Eventually, you get this inflammatory downward spiral where starvation, suffocation, toxification leads to inflammation, which leads to more starvation, suffocation, toxification, leads to more inflammation, on and on and on. This can go on for months and years and decades. And this is the cause of all long-term chronic progressive degenerative disease. The primary cause, all of it, whether you're talking autoimmunity, whether you're talking cancer, whether you're talking heart disease, whether you're talking neurological issues, it's all about the cell being starved, suffocated, toxic, then an inflammatory process leading to more starvation, suffocation, and toxification. If you understand what I just said, you could leave now, and if you're a healthcare professional, you can address any healthcare challenge without a magical protocol, without a magical formula, simply by feeding the system. That's where the nutrients come in. Oxygenating the system, there's several ways to do that. Deep breathing obviously is one of the best. And then eliminating toxicity, and that includes sugar. Now, when a cell breaks down, remember, cells are little conscious beings and they do things. When a cell breaks down, it doesn't do things. What is a cell's job? What is it supposed to do? Largely, a cell's job is to make stuff. A cell is a little extrusion machine. Do you guys remember those Play-Doh things where you put a little Play-Doh on the top and you squeeze it and out comes out a little whatever star thing or some kind of thread? That's called extrusion. A cell is an extrusion machine. It's constantly extruding substances. When a cell becomes broken down, when a cell becomes sick, it does not extrude its substances correctly. Other cells are responsible for contracting and opening, and relaxing. When a cell doesn't have food, it doesn't have oxygen, it doesn't have toxicity, it's accumulated toxicity, it won't be able to contract and release as effectively. Long story short, when a cell doesn't have the energy it needs, when a cell is not getting sustained the way it should, it isn't going to be able to do what it needs to do. That's when the disease process ensues. In order to understand how cancer is related to this, we have to talk about something called primary effects versus secondary effects. Anybody hear this term, primary versus secondary? We got lots of secondary effects, or secondary causes, I'm sorry. There's lots of secondary causes. The sun is a secondary cause. Poison is a secondary cause. Smoking is a secondary cause. Emotional and mental issues, cortisol, insulin. There's zillions of secondary causes, and we have a culture that's obsessed with secondary causes. But it's not the secondary causes that are the problem. It's the primary cause that the secondary cause leads to. And there's only one primary cause of cancer as described by the brilliant biochemist, Dr. Otto Warburg, who I'm sure many of you people have heard of. Dr. Otto Warburg, he's the one who came up with this concept of primary versus secondary. He noticed that all cancer cells have one thing in common. They have a problem with deriving energy from oxygen, and they become sugar burners. And this is the primary cause of cancer, respiratory dysfunction.
Wow, that's some great information from pharmacist Ben, our good friend. Now, we hope you've learned a lot from this video.
And if you did, we just ask that you share this on your social media and let your friends and family know about the truth about cancer. Thanks for joining in. God bless.